Really, really excited to have the special treat of James Laxton here to take you through the master class. And yeah, we're just going to do a little question and answer before. I wanted to ask all of you really briefly, who here are students, if you could raise your hands? Who are working cinematographers? Directors? Okay. Gaffers? Okay. Any assistants? So James, you've worked in a lot of indie films, commercials. You've worked with a lot of different directors. You have this project, If Beale Street Could Talk, with Barry Jenkins, and then I think after this you're doing a limited series for Amazon called The Underground Railroad.
Exactly, yeah.
And you'll be shooting all, is it 8 episodes?
I don't know exactly how many episodes it is, but yeah, Barry's going to direct all of them, and I'm going to direct all of them, so it's a long journey ahead of us. Yeah.
Okay.
You think Cameron Maj is long? Don't worry.
Yeah. So you've worked with a lot of directors. What do you look for in a director? What do you find in a good director?
Yeah, there's a lot of things I'm looking for, probably, but to name maybe a couple, there's lots of different types of directors. Someone for me that's really important is finding someone who is, speaks a similar visual language that I do. I mean, I think we all sort of have a different dialect of how we express ourselves visually, and it's not that just because it's different it's wrong, but because sometimes someone who speaks a different visual language is a good partner because you challenge each other through something and find a new language that presents on screen. But some chemistry mix of whether it's the same or similar or a conflict of some sort, but somehow these different visual languages can come together to create something interesting. So I'm looking for a partner that understands my language and I understand their language, and we can find a way to express something together. I think that's a pretty bizarre sort of conceptual answer, but there is a logic to that. And I think, very often, it's challenging to have discussions about visual language because it's not verbal. But if you can kind of get past some of the roadblocks that happen when coming together to find ways to express ourselves visually, it's that kind of connective of language that I find the most important. And then, the other thing I'll say is just someone who's willing to be open and, I talk a lot about it in terms of failure. Someone who's willing to fail with each other and willing to sort of be wrong together and find ways through that failure to make images that surprise both of us. So it's a bit of an openness mixed with a visual language. I think that's sort of how I look at it.
Okay. And when you're communicating early on with someone like new, how do you talk in visual terms? How do you show films or photos or?
There's thousands of ways because we live in a visual world, most of us do anyway, where we absorb images from a variety of places. Some of the influences that Barry and I talk about are things we see on posters, in art galleries, in music videos, and commercials, and still photography, and painting, and so it really comes from a vast sort of array, honestly, and nothing is, specific to a relationship. For example, the references for Barry and I on Moonlight were very, very different than If Beale Street Could Talk, and not just in terms of what they were, but where they came from. For example, I think on Beale Street, a lot of it came from a lot of reference photography from the era, like documentary photography from the 70s, whereas Moonlight was a bit more movie reference driven, and sort of some moving images were sort of a lot of the talking points that we started our conversations with. And I think, so it changes, even with the same relationships you might have. I think it evolves from project to project where you kind of come from, but it usually comes from, you usually start in terms of referencing, of course. It's usually a shorthand, especially when you're working with someone that you have not met yet or just starting to work with. I think for me, examples of work to talk about what's right or what's wrong or what direction you're heading, usually it's some version of that, some display, some kind.
Okay. And when you're getting a script, take us through like what your process is. How do you start thinking about the project and what you want to do with it?
I think the first thing I do when I start approaching a project is, ask. It's a funny one. probably we've all heard ways most people do it. It's like you start to compile reference imagery and you kind of start discussing things like that. But one maybe the unique thing that I do that's maybe different than other people is I oftentimes ask for directors to send me music to go along with what they have been writing to, let's say, or listening to while they've been sort of creating their world, whether they've written the screenplay or whether they're just directing it. But sometimes that can be really helpful for me in terms of pace and tone and mood and tempo and things like that. So I find that music actually has a lot to do with how I start to approach a project. It just kind of puts me in a mindset that I can approach, whether that's on-set approach today. Sometimes I play it in my car going to work and things like that, but sometimes it will in prep. I still will play it in the office or things like that to kind of just get me in a mood to start to dive into the actual work. I find music can be really helpful in that regard. But other than that, I think it's probably pretty traditional stuff, to be totally honest with you, like digging into, like for Beale Street, it takes place in the 70s, so digging into sort of photography of the 70s was big for us. And finding, the palette, color palettes and things like that, talking to the production designer and things like this. But yeah, so that's all relatively sort of probably pretty average for most DPs. I think the music thing is something that I sort of specifically enjoy.
Yeah, since you talked about music, were you listening to music early on?
For Beale
this?
Street?
Yeah, what kind of music was it?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was some of the stuff you kind of hearing in terms of where I think Barry and Nick Bertel, the composer, kind of took from their songs that were sort of, I think, influential for them that I think maybe Barry sent me early on as well. But other than that, I think there's a lot of soul stuff, 70s soul, 60s soul, yeah, things like that.
Okay. And yeah, what drew you to the project? What did you want to accomplish as a cinematographer on this one?
Well, I think what came first is working with Barry, to be honest with you. He's someone that I'm quite close with. This is my third film with him, and we went to university together way back when as well. So we have a very sort of deep and long and close relationship. We're friends outside of filmmaking. I see him most weeks just to hang out. So when he has a project and he starts talking about it with me, it's not a difficult choice as to whether I want to involve myself, because he's a partner that I hold very dearly. But then outside of that, of course, there came the story. I mean, I'm a fan, as maybe hopefully some people are in the room, and clearly Barry is, of James Baldwin's writing, and he's the author of the book that this was adapted from, and I've read his work for a long time, and been deeply affected by it. And so for me, to get the opportunity to be involved with an adaptation of him was sort of an honor, of course, and a very exciting one. Not to mention doing something, period was interesting. The visual language that I think we knew really quickly that was going to, drive our aesthetic choices in Beale Street was something new for me. I think this language that you might be seeing the teaser a little bit, but you'll hopefully see in the film for sure, is a new one for me. And that's something that I find very important, to kind of evolve and change as you grow into your career, but to challenge yourself and not just sort of say, like, listen, this is my style, and here's who I am, and sort of stick in that rooted place. I really enjoy trying to be unique to every project and every story, and attempt to change my visual vocabulary and approach. And so, when I read the novel and when talking to Barry about this thing, I knew very quickly that this was going to be that for me. It was going to be a new language, and one that I was obviously excited to do.
Okay, so describe to us what this new language was going to be. What did you want to explore? What were some of the early conversations you guys had?
So, I don't know. I think this is my first time adapting an author. And I think we often talk about author adaptations or book adaptations from a screenplay discussion. We adapt from a novel to screenplay. Maybe a little bit discussing how actors might adapt a performance from a book. But I don't think we talk a lot about how a cinematographer does it, because it seems like, for me, I think it was important to, clearly, Barry is this director, and that's clear. But James Baldwin was definitely, I think, in our minds as we started to approach and think about what this film should look like and the way in which he writes and his voice. And I think that was very influential about how we move the camera. Specifically, though, also influential on the choice of format. We chose to shoot the show on the Lexus 65, large format, like we're here talking about, of course. And to me, that was a little bit about James Baldwin's voice, to be honest with you. When I read his writing, I think of he has this lovely way of simultaneously combining this like very powerful voice and very strong with like a very a great specificity and great sort of nuance. And I think those two things combined are really unique to him. And when I read him and I see him speak, I sort of feel that there's this strength, yet sensitive. And I don't know why. I think maybe I was hearing about it. The 65 kind of came to my brain pretty quickly after thinking about that. To be honest with you, the large sensor to me provided a strong visual sensibility. But then we also have high resolution. We have all the dynamic range, and we have all that stuff. So that sort of, in my mind, sort of provided the specificity of his voice in a way, or our voice. And so even the format itself, I think, for me, was sort of influential when thinking about the new language we were trying to infuse into this new story. It goes beyond that, of course, as well, in terms of how the pace by which we move the camera. Moonlight, for example, it's a bit more aggressive and a bit sort of this wild energy that sort of finds its way through that film, visually speaking. And this time around, I think it was much more sort of rooted in a pace, in a tone that had more precision to it. I think hopefully you see a little bit of that in the teaser. But so, yeah, I guess in that regard it came in.
Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, a lot of times Alexa 65 is kind of associated with like big Marvel films, very big epic visual effects blockbusters. And then what you saw here is a very intimate, character-driven love story, basically, which is, something you...
Yeah, I think, to be honest with you, that's what mostly I hope to talk about today. I mean, that's really what I want to sort of express to you guys at some point when you leave the gymnasium. You come away with this idea that I think, yes, this format, and large format at large, I think we think about it in these sort of epic terms. And, again, I think the association with it can sometimes be for, or less more historically and more traditionally, these sort of visual effect pieces, these sort of like, big scoped things. I find the format, clearly, yes, it does work for that, but also, I think, for me, provides a great deal of intimacy and a great deal of immersion that I find to be the real power of it, to be honest with you.
Okay. And I think you shot with the prime DNA lenses, is that right? Can you talk about, the tests you did? Or
Yeah. So I tested the prime DNAs, I also tested the 765s, and I also tested the prime 65s. And they're all lovely, of course. The DNA choice specifically, it came from, the film takes place in the 70s, as maybe you can tell. So there wanted to be some sort of hint at a vintage sensibility. But at the same time, some of the concepts and ideas that are discussed in the film are very still prevalent to today. I mean, the movie talks about race relations in the U.S., the prison system, all kinds of things. So, where I'm from, these are still topical issues that we have not addressed very well, in my opinion. And so for me, it was important to still have a modern sort of lens to shoot through. So for me, the DNAs were this sort of lovely confluence of those ideas. They had a vintage sensibility, but still had a way of expressing precision in a more modern fashion. So, I think when I think about choices for format, for lenses and things like that, I find it to be like almost a contextual place where I can sort of contextualize the material that we're shooting on, that we're presenting on screen, a story exactly. So for me, the DNA choice was sort of that context. It was sort of both those things in one moment. It was vintage yet modern.
And can you talk a little bit about the lighting approach? Was there a kind of look or style that you were going for?
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, for me, lighting is always rooted somewhere. I think I find my work to be pretty natural. it's not like it's documentary per se. And there's definitely moments where we're being very expressionistic, but I think it's always tends to be rooted in a natural place. So, here we are with a lot of LEDs. That was definitely a large part of what we were using during the course of production. But, in terms of a sort of a conceptual way to talk about light for the film, it was definitely more of of trying to find romance fusing with realism. I think that's sort of a language that both Barry and I always sort of find ourselves trying to fight for. It's interesting. I mean, one of the shots I think you see in the trailer is this scene where the two characters are walking down a rainy sort of alleyway street in New York, and there's definitely like a romance to that shot. I find it quite like almost like 1940s sort of classical Hollywood cinema, that shot. And so it's moments like that that we sort of turn the dial up in terms of maybe strength and sort of style per se, always at service of story, but. So it's certain moments like that. It's I'll show a clip later on with in Moonlight with that pink light behind the character in the bathroom. So we have moments where we sort of turn the volume up a little bit light-wise, but mostly we're rooting ourselves basically in real, hopefully some naturalism.
Okay. Well, we have all these just awesome audience here, but there's a lot of people who are actually tuning in through Instagram, and we asked them, since they couldn't be here, for some questions for you. And some of the most popular questions, I'm going to go over them. But
Sure.
This is from Gotta Go Diego. Hello there. I'm an aspiring film director, and I'd like to know what a DP can do in a situation where the director has a bad day. Filmmaking comes with a lot of stress, and not every day on set is going to be a smooth one. Considering your relationship with Barry Jenkins goes way back, how did you guys manage to get through a tough day of shooting? On a podcast, Barry recalls a tough day while filming If Beale Street Could Talk. He claims he struggled to create the space and atmosphere the crew needed to carry out a unified work. What was that day like? And what can the DP do to steer production along? Cheers, I'm a big fan. It's
very
quite a
sweet.
question. Yeah.
I don't remember the day he's talking about, to be honest with you. So it's hard for me to remember exactly the moment to know, to address it specifically. But I think it's definitely a cinematographer's job at times to support your friends around you and your collaborators. I mean, it could be a director, it could be a production designer, it could be an AD, it could be an actor, an actress. So I think you need the trust and support of everyone all the time, and I think that's clear for any collaboration, whether it's filmmaking or otherwise. And so, I think when you have that type of trust and friendship and bond, the way Barry and I have, but also the way I think Beale Street, as an example, the cast was very connected to us, and we were very connected to them. And the rest of the cast and crew, the rest of the crew were the same way. And so, I think it's sort of this sort of, safety net that you feel like you can, again, going back to this idea of failing a little bit, like you can fail in, but, we'll be there no matter what to sort of catch you a little bit and kind of keep it going and keeping the day along. And I think it's that trust and that level of comfortability that I find very valuable in my collaborations, and I hope, Barry does the same. But yeah, I mean, it's harder to give exactly an answer to the day he's describing because I don't really remember it, to be honest. But, friendship and love and trust and all that stuff goes a long way when you're on set.
Seems like sense of humor, too, maybe, a little bit.
Sure, yeah. You have to be able to smile in the face of adversity. You have to sort of be able to, in a moment of frustration, keep your energy focused on the day, because these moments are fleeting, right? I mean, I work in traditionally sort of smaller productions where, if the scene isn't shot that day, it might never happen. If you don't get past a moment of difficulty, we may lose a moment that was otherwise, important to the story. And so there's not a lot of choices by which you can sort of say, well, I'm not ready, or I don't feel ready, or I don't feel right. I think it's all about sort of, keeping that energy and focus in those moments. And I don't think you can do that, obviously, without that trust that we talked about before.
Yeah, and music seems to be a pretty important, motivator for you sometimes. Do you ever use that on your sets, or does that?
Yeah, no, sometimes I'll play music, and Barry will as well. Sometimes a day begins with an important scene, with an important tone. And, I remember certain days on Beale Street where, the day started with Barry playing some songs and playing some music, whether that was score or songs that just sort of had, an emotional quality to them that put the day in context. So that's, definitely a big help. So, yeah, it was nice.
Okay, this is from Nadal. With Moonlight being such an emotional film, what are the responsibilities of the DP and his crew as far as maintaining the mood on a set like that?
I think, yeah, it is important to, when there's a sensitive moment on set, some scenes that are challenging for possibly actors or whomever, I think it's important to be sensitive to that and make sure your crew, whether that's whomever in your departments, to understand that emotional sensitivity is part of the whole dynamic, not just for the cast, but for everybody, included in terms of focus, in terms of just bringing your mental creative space. That can influence everybody, not just yourself, but also the cast, especially because they're oftentimes in a very vulnerable place. And so, yeah, I think it's on everybody's shoulders, not just my own, but to kind of keep that mood and tone, ever present through the entirety of a scene, just so we can, make sure we're not deviating from something that Barry, in this moment, for example, might be looking for.
So let's get the party started. Let's get
All
to
right.
work. So thank
Let's
you.
get to work. Thank you, Anne.